Okay, so you want to know how a drug cartel actually makes money. And honestly, who wouldn't be curious? The headlines throw around numbers like $100 billion industry. Documentaries show private jets and gold-plated everything. And it looks like the ultimate arbitrage. Buy cheap in the jungle, sell expensive on a city corner, print money forever. But here's the catch. If you actually run the numbers the way an economist would, the story falls apart almost immediately. The product isn't the business. The product is the bait. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why an operation that generates hundreds of millions of dollars a year can still collapse into bankruptcy, betrayal, or a body count within a few short years. So let's talk about what this business actually costs to run. Start with the number everyone quotes, the markup. Raw coca paste bought from a farmer costs next to nothing per kilo. By the time that same kilo crosses a few borders and gets sold on a street corner in a western city, it's worth thousands of times more. On paper, that looks like the greatest margin in the history of commerce, which means, on paper, this should be the most profitable business on earth. Except that number is a trap in itself. It measures the wrong thing. It's the price difference between raw material and retail. The same trick that makes a cup of coffee look like a 5,000% markup on water and beans. Nobody's getting rich just because the delta looks big on a spreadsheet. What matters is what gets eaten between point A and point B. And in this business, almost everything gets eaten. So let's stack the costs, the way you'd build out a real P&L. First, production and processing. Then, transportation across hostile, monitored territory, which means vehicles, boats, sometimes aircraft. All assets that can be seized in an instant. All written off as a routine cost of doing business, not a rare disaster. Then, bribery, which functions less like an occasional expense and more like a recurring line item, a kind of tax paid to every official, checkpoint, and rival group along the route. Then, loss, seizures, spoilage, product that simply vanishes because trust doesn't scale in an organization where nobody can sue anybody. Add it all up, and the eye-watering farm-to-street markup quietly shrinks into something that looks a lot more like a brutal, thin-margin logistics business. One where a huge share of gross revenue evaporates before it ever becomes profit, which means the real economics were never about the product at all. So what is the actual asset here? What's actually being bought and sold? Watch what happens the moment a cartel enters a new territory. It doesn't just start selling. It starts fighting. For corners, for routes, for the loyalty of local police, for control over who else is allowed to operate at all. That fight is not a side effect of the business. That fight is the business. Here's the plot twist. The drug was never really the product. The drug was the excuse. The real product, the thing that actually generates the premium price, is control. Territorial monopoly. The ability to guarantee that a shipment moves through a corridor without being robbed, taxed twice, or intercepted. That guarantee is worth more than the chemistry ever was. Think about it like this. A legitimate business pays for insurance, for security contracts, for legal protection of its supply chain. A cartel has no courts to enforce a contract, no police to call when a rival steals its shipment, so it has to manufacture its own protection. Through fear, through violence, through the credible threat of retaliation. That protection isn't cheap. It requires soldiers, weapons, informants, and constant reinvestment. The same way a company reinvests in infrastructure. Except this infrastructure is measured in bodies, not buildings. That's the hidden capital expenditure nobody puts in the highlight reel. The empire isn't a drug empire. It's a violence-as-a-service empire that happens to move narcotics as its cash crop. The retail price of the product isn't paying for chemistry or farming. It's paying for the war required to keep that corridor open. The city block is real estate hiding behind cocaine. The territory is the asset. The drug is just the receipt. Now let's talk about where the money actually goes once it's collected. Because this is where the model gets even more fragile. A cash-based, illegal enterprise generating hundreds of millions of dollars has a problem most legitimate businesses never face. It can't just deposit that money in a bank. Sacks of cash sitting in a warehouse are not wealth. They're a liability, a target, evidence. So a huge share of gross revenue has to be funneled into laundering, shell companies, real estate, cash-heavy front businesses, all of it bleeding fees and margin at every single step, the same way currency exchange bleeds value every time it crosses a border. Economists studying illicit finance have estimated that a meaningful cut of illicit revenue simply disappears in the laundering process alone. Value destroyed just trying to make the money usable. Then there's depreciation of a completely different kind. In a legal company, your top executive retiring is a transition. In this business, leadership turnover usually means someone is dead, arrested, or has vanished with the operating capital. Analysts who study organized crime economics have pointed out that the average tenure of a cartel leader is shockingly short, sometimes just a few years, which means the entire organization is constantly rebuilding its management structure, retraining its workforce, and renegotiating its territorial contracts from scratch. Imagine a Fortune 500 company that has to replace its entire C-suite at gunpoint every few years, and you start to understand why the billion-dollar empire narrative is mostly theater. And here's the final piece of brutal math. The safer and more profitable a route becomes, the more it attracts competitors, informants, and law enforcement attention, all at once. Success isn't rewarded with stability the way it is in a legal market. Success is punished with heat. The better the operation runs, the faster it draws the exact forces that will eventually dismantle it. There is no version of sustainable growth here, because growth itself is the trigger for collapse. Which brings us to the trap in its purest form. This was never a business built to compound wealth over decades, the way a real company is. It's a business built to convert enormous risk into a short burst of enormous cash flow, before the structural forces baked into the model, violence, betrayal, seizure, exposure, eventually catch up. A machine that converts money into territorial control. And the instant it stops feeding that control, it converts straight back into vulnerability. The fortune was never stable. It was always borrowed against time no one gets to choose the length of. So the next time you hear a number like $100 billion industry, remember what that number is actually made of. Not a company. Not an empire in any conventional sense. A logistics operation with catastrophic loss rates, wrapped around a private, unregulated war for territory, financed by a product that was never really the point. That's the real economics of a drug cartel. Not the fantasy of easy money, but a business model engineered, almost by definition, to eventually destroy itself.